just get this started here. Opening the chat. Please say hello in the chat so that I can take attendance.
Professor, I'd like to volunteer.
Lynn, sure. Who else?
I'll volunteer also.
I would like to volunteer as well.
Me too. Hello.
Yeah, me too, Paula.
I'll also volunteer, Lily.
I'll also volunteer, Layal.
Okay, that's the last one.
Noor.
Sorry,
Did
Noor.
you write my name?
Yes, I did. Okay, I'll put Noor down. That's the last one. Okay, last one. Okay, if you are volunteering, please do participate. It's not just a volunteer to have volunteered.
Yeah.
But I'll try to call on some of you. But I know if the problem is if 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people volunteer, it's very likely that 4 of you won't talk in the whole time, and so it will be only in spirit. But anyways, I hope you're all doing well. Just to clarify what we're doing this week is we're moving to the section on the scientific revolution, as you know, because you watched the opening video on that. We're going to read text by Sir Francis Bacon this particular week. The first reading selection, which you were to have done for today, was those first so many pages covering basically the introduction to what is called the Great Instauration or the Great Renewal. And then for Thursday, please have completed reading what is called the New Atlantis, which is the last part. So basically there are 3 parts, 3 readings from Bacon in the reader, but we're reading only the first one and the last one. The last one is a short story, a kind of short story, which I think you will find hopefully very interesting. It's certainly very strange. Just 1 second, I'm going to close the door real quick. Okay. As far as annotations, by Sunday, please have annotated through all of the Bacon reading, right? So the first part and the last part. That's what I'll look at on this coming Sunday. Any questions on that or any other broad issue before we get started? No? Some of you may have forgotten, so I want to remind you what I'm using here, what I'm looking at on the screen. If you're on the main page of the website and you click home, or you're on home, let's go to home. Usually this is where you go for things, but if the home button takes you to this page, right? And on these, there are these gray buttons. And the gray buttons are the ones that take you to little biographies of the authors and so on and other information. So that's what I'm looking at right at the moment. There's the video that I already, if you want the PowerPoint for that video, I don't know if I put that up on the other part of the website, but here is the PowerPoint for that video that you watched. And here are some previous, these are actually quite entertaining. He's no longer with us. He got a job elsewhere, but Joshua Norton here used to be in the philosophy department. He gives a very interesting lecture on specific scientific institutions and instruments from the period. Anyways, so we're going to talk about Francis Bacon. Now we're moving, we just finished, having just finished Alexander Pope. Remember, Pope was a little bit further on in the period that we're studying as part of the introduction. Now we're skipping back to 1561 to 1623. So if you recall, Copernicus's book was published in 1543. So this is like, you know, he's born 20 years after Copernicus died. So Copernicus would be, I mean, we would consider that would be like the age of your great grandparents, maybe something like that by comparison. So it would have been a little bit a while ago. Point being, the Bacon is not at the beginning of the scientific revolution. I mean, he's early in the scientific revolution, but there was lots of stuff going on before him. In fact, there was a whole bunch of stuff, which I presented in the lecture, I think. There were lots of things, more things that I could even go through and tell you about right now. People doing work, new inventions, books about inventions, about new theories, Gilbert's theory of the magnet, stuff in anatomy, stuff. Chemistry was a little bit later, but all kinds of stuff, much of which was nonsense, right? And didn't survive very long. But clearly there was some kind of like, not only was there something going on, you know, something noticeable, but these people felt that they were related to one another in some way. It wasn't just, they saw in each other's work similarities, right? It's similar inspirations. And for instance, one of the key things that you'll find in almost all of these writers is the idea that you should not respect authority and that you should judge for yourself, and this kind of boldness to strike out in new directions. This is as much in Bacon as we'll see it's in Descartes, as it was in Gilbert, as it was in a lot of things. For some reason, this became kind of the fad, right? Diss Aristotle and present yourself as a genius who has new ideas. But not only that, you'll see that there are a lot of similarities in other things, like the idea that they're not doing it for themselves, but they're doing it for the good of society and of people at large. This was a new idea, we'll see, that becomes part of the rhetoric and this new movement. And Bacon and Descartes, both of them, are not at the beginning, as I said. This is already in the air. And what they're doing is they're coming along and they're trying to clarify parts of this movement that they think are the right way, the right direction forward, and are the reason for its success, and to kind of clarify those things, solidify them, and support them, right, in whatever way they think is necessary. So just like any movement, you know, a political movement in Lebanon, the revolution, it's a thing happening. No one really knows what's happening. If you asked five different people have different ideas of what's happening right at that moment. And if you ask any one of them what should be done, they would say, well, all this stuff is going on, but this part of the revolution, that's bad. All right, this part is good, and this is the real revolution, and these are the other people that are exploiting it, or have the wrong ideas, or are opportunists, or whatever. Right? Anyone you ask, is that not the case? That's how people would talk about it and think about it. They think some people are just in it for the ride. Other people really know what should be done and how to move it, and they're each got their own projects and their own propaganda or literature probably, or websites or whatever, to support why this is the way forward, right? This is the way it should go. The same thing that the Bacon and Descartes are doing. They're looking at this great movement of science and they're arguing for a particular view of science and to promote a view of science. And we'll see Bacon, there's something about Bacon that's quite interesting. We can talk a little bit about science first, maybe. To see what kinds of answers you might have to this. So let me open the chat. Well, the chat is here. I'll ask you some questions. You all know what science is, right? Tell me if you know what science is in the chat. Or those of you who have your cameras open, if you want to say yes or no, it's fine too. Do you know what science is? Do you think you know what science is? Nora says she's not sure. Yes? Nora's not sure where the line is. Everyone in the chat, yes or no? Do you think you know what science is? So far, only one person has. Hala, no. Lynn, maybe. Uh-oh. So Lynn has something to teach us all. Everyone is saying no. Huh. I think you do. I think many of you, yeah, Diala, yes, but I wouldn't be able to give a specific definition. Rima, yes, but it's not clear in an elaborate sentence. Okay. So most of you say no, but I think you probably think yes. Funnily enough, Lynn says maybe, so maybe you didn't want to say yes because you didn't want to have to follow that up. Lynn, tell us what science might be.
Like for me, when I think about science, what I think about is inventions and discoveries of new things and trying to understand the world around us through maybe principles developed by people and theories to
Yeah.
back things up, and these theories, of course, they're not always true and they are until proven wrong, but that's what I think about science.
Okay. So that's a very general, description of science. When we ask what something is, that's quite a complicated. I think maybe that's why a lot of you said no. You weren't sure you'd be able to say more specifically, maybe than what Lynn said, of what it is, and you knew you might get into trouble real quick if I ask you, well, lots of people have ideas about the world, right? And they look for reasons. I mean, flat earthers have a theory of the world, and they gather evidence for their theory of the world and so on. I don't think any of us would call it science. There's a famous, actually this has actually created a problem in a way. All kinds of things that pretend to be scientific that aren't. Any of you ever heard of, what is it called? Cargo, something, some of you know of Richard Feynman? You heard of Richard Feynman? He's a Nobel Prize winning physicist. I forget what it's called. Cargo cult science. Watch a video about that sometime. You'll find a lot of it in the university. So he liked to distinguish between what is science and what isn't science. He didn't know what science was, but he knew that a lot of things, because science is so popular, right? Like science has become part of our culture such that everybody respects science. Even so it becomes profitable to try to be like science, right? Like 9 out of 10 doctors recommend, my toothpaste. It's like I did a scientific study. I gathered evidence from 9 out of 10 doctors. That's clothing something which is not scientific whatsoever in the language of science, right? Or these stupid things you take at the end of the semester, where you fill in little bubbles about 1 through 5, whether the instructor knew what he was doing, everyone in the university who has half a brain knows that those things are stupid, and that there's no way to quantify education. And if we knew how to educate, and if you knew what was good for you and being educated, we would have had this thing figured out a long time ago, but we don't, because that's not how it works. And no matter how many bubble sheets we fill out or how many surveys we take, it doesn't change anything. But that is, supposed to be quantifiable. We quantify, we ask questions, we study, we make a change in a course, and then we do a survey and we collect evidence, and it never leads anywhere because no one knows what a 4 means, right? And like, if I got 4s on that, what should I do? It doesn't, but there's a lot of this in culture, right? Of like making something look scientific by assigning numbers to it and crunching numbers and trying to mimic science. But it, for some reason, isn't science, right? We don't know why it's not science. I don't know why doing all these surveys and things don't work. I just know it doesn't work. Now, Bacon would say, I'm using the right method for figuring out what is good science, which is, does it work or doesn't it? Like, I can't prove why it doesn't work, but if it works for Bacon, we'll see that is like his criterion of the true scientific theory, is that it leads to something that Len mentioned, discoveries, to technology, to so these sorts of things. He calls these the fruits, as we'll see. So if a theory has fruits, then it's perhaps a true theory. Descartes will have another way. Now, what was this thing, just to let you know, because it's kind of funny, cargo cult science, he used to explain this difference between true science, right? And things that mimic science but are not science. He called these things that mimic science cargo cult science, because there's this story of natives who lived on an island next to a military base, right? And on they always saw that on the military, so this was like a very isolated tribe of people, right? And so they saw this military base and what happened, and they saw these planes come down delivering cargo all the time, right? And like whenever the men on the base would go out to the landing strip, a plane would come, right, and deliver cargo. And so they built themselves on their island a little landing strip. And they all went out because they thought that by building a landing strip and going out and surrounding it, that you were causing the cargo to come, right? So they were acting like, so the idea is they're acting like they're doing science and hope, and like maybe miraculously truth will come to them, right? Similarly, they were acting like they were on this military base and just waiting for the airplanes to come and bring the cargo. Of course, the airplanes weren't going to bring cargo, because the reason, it's not by acting like science that it becomes science. It's not like acting like a plane is going to come that makes a plane come, right? This is the idea. It's a nice little idea. So you'll probably see around you all the time cargo cult science now, because we have this kind of reverence for things that seem scientific. This also probably makes it hard to say what is science, right? If I asked you, is physics a science? I think you're all going to say yes, right? Physics is a science, you agree? If anything is a science, physics is a science. Is mathematics a science?
Yes, I.
Hollis
Sir,
says no.
Sir, so you said that Bacon thinks something is a theory is scientific if it has fruits.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And mathematics theories have fruits, but the fruits are theoretical.
Yeah.
Also. Like there's no practical. There isn't always like a practical fruit for a scientific theory, for a mathematical theory.
Not directly.
Yeah. So would he still consider math science?
Well, you could say there are fruits in another sense, in that certain mathematical theories lead to other mathematical theories, right? They have kind of their own kinds of fruits. This actually, I'll bring up an example very soon of this in the history of mathematics when we talk a little bit more about that. Because there is a part of mathematics that talks like this about mathematics. Like what should we allow in mathematics? Things that lead to more mathematics. And what should we not allow in mathematics? Things that make mathematics fall apart, right? So in the past, like in the distant past, people used to think like numbers, well, those things are real and that's what math is about. In fact, the Pythagoreans thought the only real numbers were the whole numbers and the fractions, because fractions were made out of whole numbers. And anything else that looked like mathematics was cargo cult mathematics, because it didn't really wasn't reducible to numbers or proportions of numbers. And so they didn't allow things like irrational numbers. So for the Pythagoreans, the square with 1-inch sides doesn't have there's no length and it's diagonal because that's a square root of 2, right? Which is not a number for them. That was a big problem for the Pythagoreans. So that's the way math used to work. And that's still sometimes the way people think about mathematics. Like there's this stuff called mathematics, and then there's stuff that's not mathematics. But much of modern mathematics is so crazy, right? Things that have happened in the history of mathematics have been so unexpected at times that people were very unsure about how you determine what is real mathematics and what is not. Also, another time people thought you couldn't do mathematics about infinite numbers. That's just nonsense. That's crackpot, stuff. And now it's a fundamental accepted part of all mathematics. So now how do you just, it's like science, right? Like how do you determine what is science and not? How do you determine what's mathematics or not? What do you determine is within biology or not? That's happening to philosophy now as well. Like the things that people do in philosophy now were never would have been considered part of philosophy before, or even philosophical. So this is another issue. We'll talk about it a little bit. So it's not a problem unique to science. I think many of you your intuition would be that mathematics isn't a science. I don't know why, but that's not how we tend to use the word. And so maybe common usage, that seems a bit strange. Making it a little more difficult, is sociology a science? Would you say?
Yeah, I say yeah.
Sociology, Hala says.
Sir, there are people, there is like a huge fraction of people who think that sociology and psychology are pseudosciences.
Yeah.
And that's because they use the ways of science to prove things that are not scientific.
So I said,
I don't have an answer.
and here's a funny one, right? Noor says, no, it's apparently no, it's not a science, it's a social science. That's a funny statement. Is political science a science? It's a funny statement because a social science is a science, right? But what, Abdul?
Isn't everything that is called science is science? Whether it's social or natural?
Well, the idea is there are a certain kind of science, right? A social science, a natural science, a political science. In my other class, almost everyone said political science is not a science, right?
But it's called science.
But it's called political science. What is going on here? Well, this is the part of the problem. We don't know what science is, but most of you have been kind of brought up with a certain use of science that even as applied to sociology, psychology, the social sciences, political science, you're like, those don't seem like sciences to me, but yet the term is a science. When we ask ourselves what a science, does someone want to tell me what makes a science a science? Like what would, if psychology is not a science, why wouldn't it be a science?
Is a science anything that can be falsified?
So this is a very popular response. It comes from a philosopher named Charles Popper, right? The idea that the difference between a scientific theory and a non-scientific theory is that a scientific theory can be falsified, right? That doesn't tell us what science is. That just tells us whether a theory is a potential scientific theory. But science is about the whole shebang, right? It's not just making up hypotheses, but it has to do with how hypotheses are proven and tested and formulated and so on and so forth, right? One popular response as well, here's one that makes it even more complicated. Hala says, I think science tries to explain things that happen around us. A 3-year-old tries to explain things around themselves, right? But that is not necessarily science. I would guess not, right?
It's the most inclusive. I feel like it's the most inclusive, like how political science tries to explain how, let's say, for example, like how countries depend on each other. That's like how that's explaining it. Also physics, the same thing. Psychology, and how the mind works. Why do we think this way and not that way? But math, I just find it difficult to think that math could be a science. It just doesn't work for me.
Interesting. Is philosophy a science? It's okay, you can say what you want, even though I'm also in the philosophy department. Hala says yes. Oh, she's trying to get brownie points.
No, not at all. I just do think it is a science because I don't know if you're making fun of me or not. I mean, the way that they also try to explain things. It's the same thing. I mean, it's just different methods and different. I mean, like political science that explains it in a different way. Sociology explains it in a different way, and I also think philosophy does the same thing.
Okay. In this respect, I mean, so one thing we can kind of, there are some safe things we can say about science, which would apply to philosophy as well. You know, for the greatest, until about 150 years ago, philosophy was often referred to as the queen of the sciences, right? Which meant the science of the sciences, like the science without which there would be no other science. That was the traditional view of philosophy. So that's quite interesting in itself. But one thing we can say that philosophy shares and other sciences shares, they all aim at something called truth, right? They're all supposed to be an account, an expression of the truth, right? History, is history scientific? That's another. Actually, history came about through the application of scientific methods to storytelling, because, you know, historians have theories about the past and then they try to disprove them and so on and so forth, right? So even history has its kind of method. So all of them have methods that aim at truth. We can agree that that's part of science, but that's not enough to make something scientific, right? What more is required? No one knows. That's the short answer. Right? That's why there's all these confusions here. Mainly when people talk about the use of the word science, like we are now, all you're doing is trying to think about what the popular usage of the word is, as informed by watching YouTube videos and whatever, right? Like, it's not, it's more like you're trying to figure out what people call science than what science is. You can probably feel that right now. Like, that's why mathematics is a weird one, because you're like, we don't tend to use the word about it, but I don't know why. And that changes, that's fashion. Like I said, it would not have been at all strange for over 1,000 years to call philosophy a science. But now almost no student would ever think of calling philosophy a science. That's has nothing to do with them themselves. That's just about the usage of words and culture and language. So we have to go a little bit more deeply to think about like what could be the differences. Now, interestingly, just as a side note, for some of you wondering about the relationship between philosophy and science, is philosophy has always been closely allied with science, not only in the sense of being like, let's say the queen of the sciences, but science and philosophy at many moments in history have been the same thing. Now, one of the mistakes we make when we think about science is we identify it by things we see that are associated with it, right? Like if I ask you, what do you think of science? A lot of you are going to talk about beakers and you know, instruments, and this is what comes to your mind when you think about science, like sciencey looking stuff, right? Stuff you'd see in a movie in a laboratory. This is what you think of science. And when you think of science, someone doing science, you think of a scientist, right? Someone whose job it is to be a scientist. But if obviously anybody can do science, anybody can do philosophy. It's not for the philosopher. You, at some moments in your life, are doing philosophy, whether you know it or not. At sometimes you're doing science. And sometimes you're doing both at the same time. When would those moments be? And this has been true in the history of science. Like at certain moments, back with the Pythagoreans. Pythagoras is a famous philosopher, but he's a famous mathematician and a famous scientist, right? He's considered in the history of all three. Albert Einstein is considered an important philosopher and an important scientist. Sir Isaac Newton was considered an important philosopher and an important scientist. Not because they did philosophy at one moment and science another, but because their scientific theories were such that they were philosophical and scientific at the same time. Now, why? What's the difference there? Well, think about, and that doesn't include all of science. So like certain moments, let's think of like Einstein. What was Einstein's great contribution, according to anyone?
Theory of relativity.
Theory of relativity. And why was this such a major contribution? Why is it not like the invention of the iPhone?
Because it impacted fundamental things we thought we knew about the universe, and he like changed the way we knew these things.
Excellent. Yes, you hit it perfectly, because his inventing the iPhone didn't change anything about our fundamental conception of reality. But Einstein changed how we thought about time and space itself. And so he was asking a fundamental question that had a scientific impact, but it also changed how we think about our own lives and everything, right? It was a fundamental question. Calculus, the invention of the calculus with Newton, was the same thing, because it involved questions of infinity and finitude. And you know, there's this weird idea in calculus that you can add up an infinite number of, you know, infinitely thin two-dimensional slices of space and get a volume of, say, 3, right? That was a philosophical problem. Like, how is that conceivable that this would work? Any of you have this problem when you learned calculus? You're like, wait a minute, this is like spooky stuff suddenly. You can't do that. An infinitely long horn cannot contain a volume of 3, right? The volume within, you know, this, what is it called? The trumpet of, it's a mathematical form. It looks like a horn, right? But it's basically asymptotic, but it's spun around the axis, so it makes like a horn. And you can sum the volume of that. It's infinitely long, but it has a finite volume, right? That for over 100 years, philosophers were discussing these things. But those philosophers were also mathematicians at the same time. You'll find them in the history of both. And people had problems, like, and the way it worked out was this. It's very disappointing. I mean, I had the same thing when I was in school. I was like, I went to my math teacher and I was like, I know we can do this, but I'm not satisfied that I understand why I can do this. And my teacher's response was, if you think like that, you'll never be a mathematician. If you keep asking questions, you'll never be a mathematician.
So there was this one time I was talking to my professor about, we were proving something with strong induction. And I told him, I know this works, like I see like the method works, but I'm not like convinced, you know, as to why this method works to prove this. And he told me, if you waste time thinking like that on the exam, you're gonna like probably like not pass. So he's like, just solve the problem.
Just accept it. So what's going on there? And this relates to Bacon in a way, because what happened then in science and in philosophy? Well, philosophy still talks about a lot of those questions. They've never been solved. And philosophy is obsessed with these unsolved questions. That's why philosophy doesn't look like science. Like, philosophers aren't interested in things we've solved. They're only interested in the stuff you haven't solved. So as soon as it's solved, they move on and go to other things. And so progressively, as science has figured things out, those things have broken off from philosophy, right? And so mathematics, what do? They say, yeah, this is a huge problem, and your teacher should have been a little better, so should have mine. They should have said, no one knows why it works. We don't know why, but we got tired of talking about it. And we went by this fundamental idea. We said, look, we had problems with it and we continued to discuss it as long as those problems created mathematical problems. So when they dealt with infinity, for instance, you could come up with all kinds of paradoxes and things that made mathematics break down. And some uses of infinity worked and some of them didn't. And they tried to figure out why some worked and some didn't, and they never figured out that question. And so they said, instead, let's just make up rules. If it makes mathematics break down, we don't let it, we stop doing it. We say you can't do it. And if it doesn't, and mathematics works and continues working, then we say you can do it, at least until we see where if it eventually makes mathematics break down. And so that allowed them to admit all kinds of crazy stuff into mathematics that on the face of it, this is how initially how irrational numbers were introduced, but this is how imaginary numbers, they were introduced to solve a problem. People thought they weren't really mathematics. And then it turned out they were completely consistent and you could solve all the problems and nothing broke down as long as you followed some rules. And then they said, okay, it's part of mathematics. With infinities, they found some infinite series you can't treat them as adding up to a number, right? And they found that other series, you can treat them as adding up to a finite number. They don't know why, but because they never add up, right? Because they're infinite, they just say, I can let this series of numbers be 4 and everything works. But if I let this series of numbers be 4, it doesn't work anymore. And mathematics breaks down and I end up with contradictions. And then they just wrote up those rules and mathematicians follow those rules. And once you start following those rules and doing calculus, then you're no longer questioning anything fundamental anymore, right? You're just applying calculus. And an engineer now who uses those rules is not doing philosophy, but they are still doing math, right? But the person who was initially doing that, someone like Newton, was doing math and philosophy because they were questioning those fundamental rules and discovering them for the first time. So this is interesting. Hala says they will never make sense to me. They're not, that's the admission, they're never gonna make sense. There are all kinds of fun paradoxes with infinity. What is dividing something by 0? Why can't you do it? Why not? Because mathematics doesn't work anymore if you do so, right? So the rules don't do it. That's it. This is a different way of thinking about truth though, right? There's one way that, the way that like Nora and I had, and I'm sure many of you others had, is like you're taught to believe something is true because you can see that it is true. You can prove that it's true. Not that it works and that it allows you to do math that you couldn't do before. That's a weird criterion of making something true. But we'll see, this is very much what Bacon thinks about truth. If it works, then, and the better it works, the more likely it is that it's true. And he believes that this idea of proving things that are to be true is a complete misguided way of doing science. Like it should never be the case that you think in science you can prove something to be true. This is also what was part of the later Karl Popper's view of falsification. Science shouldn't aim to prove things are true. It should simply propound theories and put them to the test, and if they survive. But this is a little bit different from Bacon's idea, because one of the criteria of truth for Bacon is not only that it survives tests, but that it also produces fruits, that it benefits mankind, that it restores power over nature. If there's one thing you should always remember about Bacon, and should stick in your mind, is he equates knowledge and power. He says human knowledge and human power come to the same thing. This means both that having knowledge gives you power, but it also means that if something doesn't give you power, it's not really knowledge. So there's a two-way street there, right? And that the second one is more important for him. This is why these things he calls the fruits of knowledge are we'll see, he talks about this kind of endlessly. It's one of his key ideas, that true knowledge demonstrates its own truth through the fruits that it produces. All right. Okay, so let's get to Bacon. more particularly here. On the website, let's see. So here, so Bacon 1561 to 1626. So he was, as I told you in the video, he's not at the beginning of science, but all that stuff is going on in science, and he's trying to, as I said, promote a certain vision of it. He was not your typical, what you would think of as your typical scientist. He's not a famous scientist in himself. He did some scientific experiments, but I don't think there's anything he discovered that was important. His main work was in the argument he made for how science should proceed and why we should support and promote science, right? Just kind of a propagandist for science. Just so he was a political, he was a chancellor in the English government. He got in trouble. He embezzled money and got thrown in jail. He had his own problems. He was a famous writer. One of the first books I ever read as a young person was the Essays of Sir Francis Bacon. It's rather dry, so I don't recommend it to your children when you have them. So he was famous as a writer, as a literary figure. Often you've probably heard this, that some people at one time thought maybe Bacon could have been Shakespeare. In fact, George Cantor, who was the guy who invented the idea of infinite numbers in mathematics, set theory, these things, all if not, and cardinal numbers and all this stuff. This German guy, George Cantor, he spent most of his free time trying to prove that Francis Bacon was Shakespeare. We now know that is not true and is nowhere near true, but they lived at the same time, right? They lived under the same king, King James I. Bacon had enough to do on his own not to write Shakespeare's plays. But that all came about as this idea because no one could believe that Shakespeare, uneducated, as he supposedly was, or poorly educated from the lower classes, could have written such stories. So they thought maybe Bacon, under the pseudonym of Shakespeare, wrote these plays. No, instead he spent his time writing this thing called the Great Instauration, the Great Renewal, which was supposed to outline the whole of science in every dimension. It was this enormous project, which he never completed. He did complete several parts of it. He completed something called the advancement of learning, or what's sometimes called the augmentation of science, the growth of science. A book called The New Organon, which is the second reading in our section, which you skip. That was particularly devoted to the methodology of science. And it was supposed to replace Aristotle's Organon, which was the Aristotelian methodology of science, with his own new Organon. That's all about induction, and we'll talk about these things called the idols, prejudices, and so on, and how to combat them. Let's see. So he obviously lived at the time when one of the most famous things going on in Europe, or that was known about in Europe, were the voyages of Christopher Columbus and of others, the conquistadors and others from Spain and England and Italy to the Americas. And remember, Bruno used them as a symbol of the opposite of what he aimed for. Bacon adopts them as the symbol, as a positive symbol, the explorations of the Americas in all their dimensions. I think by the end of this, many of you are not going to like Bacon. He's a weird fellow. He's extremely chauvinistic, you will find. Not like provocatively so, but he just thinks men are superior, right? And you'll see this in his books and writings, particularly in the story we'll read for Thursday. And he bases that on Christianity. So he's extremely Christian in his outlook, which is something you will not expect, right? Father of modern science, progressive of modern science, but he thinks modern science is he couches it and encases it in a thoroughly Christian narrative. So science is given to mankind as a way to restore man's rightful ownership over nature and power over nature. Essentially, before the fall of Adam and Eve, human beings were in a perfect relationship to nature and controlled nature. But with the fall, we lost that knowledge. And so science is what God gave us so that we can, through our own power, restore our control over nature. And science and Christian religion are perfectly consistent with one another. Not only that, but it's a very, as I say, a very like male-dominated version of Christianity, which was probably typical of the time, right? You'll find it very interesting and probably also offensive, but it'll be interesting. So keep that in mind. Also, when he thinks about Columbus and others, that's part of that whole story, right? Now, Bacon, I want to say some other things about Bacon, and we'll come back to that symbolism of the New World. But Bacon, if you were to think about science, what makes science science? So far, everything we've talked about, maybe it has to do with a methodology, maybe it has to do with experimentation and so on. All of these, in a certain sense, are secondary to Bacon, to certain other things that you probably don't think about science at all. You do, you know it, but when you think about what makes science science, it just probably doesn't occur to you, which is the institutions of science. This is Bacon's proposal in a way. What makes science science is not a way of thinking by itself, not a method by itself, but a set of practices and institutions that are social in nature. Does that sound strange to you? You say, well, what makes physics a science? It has nothing to do with it itself. It has to do with how it's practiced. What do I possibly mean by that? What are the institutions of science? In the modern world, what would you identify as the institutions of science?
Is it the methods used?
I mean, institutions, like the university is an institution of science, isn't it? Lynn?
Any research institute, I guess.
Yeah, they still exist in in most countries. I don't know if Lebanon has one, but most European countries, certainly North America. Do they have one? Do you have some kind of academy of science or something?
We do, but they're not active.
They're not active.
They just get paid.
It's probably modeled. The French have the Academy of Science, right? The French Academy. These academies, these are institutions of science. Institutions of science are more than that, though. They're also the journals. Journals are institutions of science. They're large organizations that deal with these, not just the sharing. That's not the key thing with journals, right? It's not just that you publish results, but those results are published so that other scientists can try to recreate your experiments and criticize your work, right? That's what journals are all about. Peer review, that's an institution of science. Now, there's this view of science that Bacon has, that these are the things that make science science. The difference between pseudoscience and real science is this institutionalization that makes it work. Now, what are parts of that that institutionalization is based upon certain ideas, right? Like that knowledge is a public good. That's why those institutions are there. Knowledge is only possible through community activity. Now, why might that be? Bacon has, for instance, here's a little encapsulated vision of Bacon, how Bacon thinks about this. You and I each have our own prejudices, right? If you come up with a theory, a brilliant theory, you would really like it to be true, right? You would like it to be true. That means that when you get your data and you've invested a lot of time and work into your theory, it's very hard for you to accept data that is going to conflict with your theory, right? You're going to look for, oh, maybe I didn't quite do the instrument right or something. My theory, it's still got to be true. People even falsify. Famous scientists have been found to falsify their own data, right? Or calculations or whatever. We have prejudices. Not only that, but we have other prejudices, like not ones like we simply want our knowledge to be true, but we have each of us, a certain way of thinking that is unique to us as individuals because of our culture, because of our background, because of the way our particular mind works. Some people are very impressed with general theories of everything, right? Other people are very skeptical of such theories by their nature. That's the way they are. And so each of us by ourselves would be a very bad scientist. But through an institution like peer-reviewed journals, we can take, since we don't share our prejudices, we have different prejudices, we can use this as, if I give my theory to you and you don't see it as obviously true as I do, then that makes me think that maybe I think it's true because of one of my prejudices and not because it is true. So Bacon compares the way we know the world around us and ourselves to like distorted mirrors. You reflect the world in your way and I reflect the world in my way. But say we both look at a flower in our mirror, and in your mirror, it's long and tall, and in my mirror, it's short and fat, right? We say probably the flower is neither long and tall nor short and fat. That must be from the way our mirrors work. But in both our mirrors, it's blue. And now we say, well, maybe the flower really is blue because it's in both of our mirrors, right? And we can find out better by getting a third mirror and maybe a fourth mirror and maybe a fifth mirror that are all distorted in different ways. And it's blue in all the mirrors. And now we start to think, blue is actually a feature of, it's blue in all the mirrors because the flower is blue. But it's a different size and shape in all the mirrors. So its size and shape, we would have to find another way of figuring out what its true size and shape is, right? Now, Bacon even goes one step further. He thinks these institutions should be designed not only to generally combat prejudices, but based upon a theory itself of human prejudice. So we should not only know there are prejudices, but we should study our prejudices to know how they work so that we can better design institutions and practices to combat them. So what we might do is we might study your mirror and the way it's distorted, right? And we might study how light reflects off mirrors. And you know that you can do this, like if you take a funhouse mirror, right? And you show an image in it, you can create, and then take that image and put it on your computer, you can create an algorithm that from a knowledge of the shape of the mirror, it can reconstruct the original image as it actually was, right? You just have to recalculate based upon the curvature of the mirror where the light rays were really coming from instead of where they appear to be coming from. And then you can reconstruct the image. And that kind of, that computer program would be built upon a theory of optics, and it could reconstruct from the distorted image the original image. This is how Bacon is thinking about his project. He's got these things called the idols, where we study the prejudices and distorting power of human nature itself, and design through a precise knowledge of that, how to reconstruct how nature would look to us if we didn't distort it. So this is a major part of his project. So it's like having a telescope. You want to do astronomy, but your telescope is broken or distorts your image, so you have to study telescopes to fix it and figure out how to redesign it so that you can continue with your project. That means Bacon sees his project as standing before science begins. It's a recalibration of the instrument itself, which is the human mind and the human senses. And so this means Bacon's whole project falls really well under something we saw in Alexander Pope, right? The proper study of mankind is man. Before science, true science is only possible through a prior study of human nature. Right? So we have to turn back to ourselves. So that puts him within the large story. Now, because of this, not surprisingly, he argues that, and you can see that in that claim, knowledge and power come to the same thing. He argues that it's the role of the government, because it's the role of the government to better human beings' lives, governments should invest in science. And so he got the English government to pay for the founding of the British Academy, which he did not live to see. But here is a frontispiece to the Acts. So all these academies, they were generated as the result of Bacon's plan. His plan was to create these large institutions filled with all the most important scholars, and simply by promoting and contributing to science, you became a member of the society. The society published its findings in these things called its Acts, which were its peer review journal. It's the first peer review journals in existence. They didn't peer review like we do. They didn't send them out to reviews. Instead, they did the peer review right there in the academy. So like a Newton would show up at the academy with his latest paper on optics, for instance, and he would read it into the Acts. And all the scholars would sit there and listen to him read his paper, and they would respond to it and so on, and it would be published in the journal. The British Academy published the first ever journal of science. The Berlin Academy published the first ever journal in Germany. It was published in Latin though, because they still hadn't kind of become fully popular. They also had projects like the composition of, for instance, the encyclopedia. You've all heard of the French encyclopedia? That's not the first attempt at an encyclopedia. The British Academy attempted an encyclopedia, but it is the longest and most famous one. This was by the French Academy. A bunch of French philosophers and scientists got together to write a series of books that contained a digest of all human knowledge. The full cycle or circle of human knowledge. That's why it's called the encyclopedia. It's a circle that contains all of knowledge. And it was, interestingly, it's a very nice combination here. It's the precursor of what we call Wikipedia, right? This is what the encyclopedia was. And of course, they didn't have the internet, so they had to sell it, which they very much wanted to do. This was at the time of the printing press. So you would sign up as a wealthy person to receive each edition, each volume of the encyclopedia as it was printed, right? It's also a very nice money-making idea, which it was, because there's a lot of knowledge in the world. So unlike, Dickens, you didn't have to write these huge novels. You could just publish volume after volume after volume of the knowledge of all knowledge in the world in the encyclopedia. And this has been for a long time. Any of you go to old bookstores and you see old Encyclopedia Britannica? These, of course, what were they? They wanted to sell to every household. These 40 books, make a lot of money. So you see, this kind of thing goes with the invention of the printing press as well. Also the economy based on the printing press, but also the printing press itself is a kind of institution. Publishing is a kind of institution without which science like this wouldn't have been possible. And so if you take the Baconian line, if you ask why science didn't take off in the medieval period or in the ancient world, it would be because of sociological reasons, not because of any kind of magical thing that was discovered, that suddenly people discovered science versus pseudoscience. Pseudoscience is just pseudoscience because it was just one guy making up some ideas and not sharing them with others and not keeping secrets and so on and so forth. And this is what kept it from making progress. And this is how Bacon, as I said, will think about science. He doesn't think there's something called science and something called not science. He thinks there is good science that is or knowledge that is well constructed and founded and goes through these institutions, and science that isn't, or knowledge that isn't. And that's the real distinction. So just some, you can look at some of these. This is the King James that he lived under in England. Not too interesting. A statue of Bacon in the US Library of Congress. He's just held up as, I mean, he's one of the mythical figures of modern science, right? Bacon, there's no end to what you'll hear about him. Now here, I'm going to talk about this a little bit. This is it's also here in your book. Does anyone know what this is a picture of? This was the frontispiece to his major work, The Great Renewal, right? What's being pictured here?
The discovery of America, or sailing into the New World.
Something like this. You're not sure, but you're guessing.
Yeah.
Anyone else have an idea? No footnote here. So these things, so this was one of the supposed, remember, you've heard these things called the ancient wonders of the world. They don't stand anymore, but we know where they might have been then. These were called the Pillars of Hercules. Hercules, or Heracles, same guy, was the most famous Greek hero, famous for having done something bad, and the gods made him perform these labors. Like all ancient Greek heroes, or Odysseus, if you took 201, they don't do heroic things. Instead, they heroically suffer. That's what their heroism is about. It's about suffering. So he had to do all these horrible things. He had to travel all over the ancient world and to perform these duties, one of which was, for instance, to clean out the stalls, clean the horse crap out of the stalls of a divine horses, right? This is the kind of labors he had. They're not heroic, they're not saving people and so on. They're these kinds of things. And of those great journeys all over the Greek world to perform his labors, he never went farther. This was the limit of where he went. They're called the Pillars of Hercules. All right. So to the ancients, it was the symbol of the end of the known world. Don't go beyond it, was the idea. You don't want to go here. Now, why? There's a good reason you wouldn't want to. Ancient navigation was poor. Ancient ships were not made for voyages of sometimes years, right? Ancient mariners only generally ever sailed next to the coast. They used the coast as the way to find their path for the most part, because they didn't want to get lost and they didn't want to run out of food at sea. Now, if you go out through these pillars were supposedly at the edge of what's called Gibraltar now. So sometimes these are called the Pillars of Gibraltar, southern Spain. And if you were to head out here, you're heading out straight into the Atlantic Ocean, right? Towards North and South America. So there's no coast to be followed. If you sailed out here, you didn't come back. So it's like, this is why some people thought maybe it's the edge of the world or something, these kinds of ideas. Maybe you just sail right off. So you had to be bold and perhaps crazy and a little bit stupid to sail out here. Now that's the symbol for Bacon, sailing out here, not just one person, but a series of ships. This is him, and these are others following him, right, through these straits. And it says, many will come afterwards. This is what it says down here in Latin. Many will come afterwards and augment or grow science. So he sees science like this sailing past the limits of the known world into the unknown, right? But of course, he's thinking of Columbus. Columbus did this. Why did Columbus do this? Does anyone know why? Can you tell us why did Columbus? He was a little bit stupid. He was definitely crazy, but those are not the main reasons. Anyone know what the main reason was Columbus sailed to the New World? Someone's got to know. Your high schools weren't that bad, were they? What do you think? Why would a crazy dumb guy do this? Not only did he do it, but he spent a good part of his life trying to convince people to help him do it, right? It was not just something he did off by accident. He devoted his life to doing this and eventually got to do it. Of course, Columbus was from, and a lot of these people were from Italy, right? But he didn't sail in an Italian ship, nor did others. Who was it funded by? King of Spain, right?
He wanted to, was it because he wanted to get the goods from India to other parts of the world and whatever, like it was for trade?
Columbus, yeah, Abdul?
Didn't he want to go from Europe to Asia for the purpose of trading, and then by mistake, he stumbled upon America?
So, you ever watch, you watch, I don't know if they have it here on TV, late night television, like some guy who wants to sell you a thing to cut up vegetables or something, to make a lot of money really quick. They call it get rich quick scheme. That's what Columbus was doing. He was not the only one. And his get rich quick scheme was, guess what you need to get rich? You need goods from abroad, perhaps from India. It takes a insanely long time, and you have to cross all kinds of very treacherous land to get goods from India. So he had this idea. He had a bunch of crazy theories that the Earth was much smaller than it actually is. He should have died, right?
He thought by going this way,
he thought he could go to India the short way. He thought he would find
and he thought he actually got there.
He thought it was,
instead of going around, he just stopped in America instead of going the other way.
Yeah, it would have, if he had not run into North America, he would have died, or into South America. And when he landed in South America, he thought it was India, which is why they were called Indians, right? He got there, and lo and behold, they didn't have any of the goods that he wanted. And so how did he even get to do this? That's what he did. He went to the King of Spain. King of Spain's engaged in wars with other European countries. Since ancient times, what's the number one thing you need to fight a war? You need money. Because you have to pay people to build ships and so on. Money equals power. Just as Bacon said, technology and so on. A ship is technology, weapons are technology. You need to pay people to build them. You need money. So he went to the King of Spain and said, here, give me some ships, give me a few ships, give me some men, and pay me, and I will go and make you huge amounts of money by finding a short path to India. And then you will have all the money you need to kill off all those Frenchmen and Englishmen you want to get rid of, right? And the king thought, it's a small investment. This guy's crazy, but what if it's true? Gives him a little bit of money. He goes off. He discovers South America, and they don't have the goods. That is not India, but they have something that's even better. They have huge amounts of gold, and the important thing, they don't have guns. Yes. So the gold is easy to get, and they slaughter and exploit all these people, as we all know. Doesn't mean those cultures were fantastic. Some of those cultures were quite brutal in themselves and were famous for human, sacrifice of human beings and children and babies and stuff. They had their own problems, but they got wiped out pretty much. I mean, the whole civilization, so the Incas and so on, the whole civilization disappeared as a result. Millions of people died as a result of this. And it was all for the money, the gold. The gold was sent back to Europe, and it funded the wars. And the only reason, now how do you get so much, what did the Europeans want the gold for, and why was that so important at that moment? Well, it so happened at that very moment, China wanted to turn gold into its national currency. And so they needed large amounts of gold, and they would trade weapons and other things for the gold to the Europeans, so the Europeans could fight their wars against each other. And that's exactly what happened. And the gold from South America fueled the wars for the next 150 years in Europe. And that's why Spain and England became the major world powers at this time. And they had huge fleets of ships and so on, because they could build ships, because they had all the wealth that came from the Americans. Now, this is what Bacon, and already we noticed that in Bruno's time, which was contemporaneous with Bacon, he saw this as the opposite of what he wanted to do, exploit the things that he discovered. But Bacon takes this as, this is me, right? This is what my science is going to do. It's going to restore us. So Bacon would be on the side of the people who said, we have the right to take that gold from these people because we are Christians and so on, right? In fact, you maybe know that many things were taken to North America aside from diseases and death. And those are also kind of symbolized here, kind of in a hidden way. The immediate symbol here is of breaking out and discover, and the boldness to discover the new world and go beyond the past. But also here is the idea of bringing back power and wealth, right? What will we find there? What Columbus found, we will bring back with us and restore power to ourselves. Also, for Bacon, I think it would mean, though it's a, like a third or fourth meaning here, is that he's taking Christianity with him, right? Spreading it. The Catholics, all of South America is pretty much Catholic. This is why the kings sent priests with the soldiers and the conquistadors who were just basically swashbuckling pirates to steal everything. But then they decided that they had brought, I don't know if he brought syphilis back. I don't know if personally he did, I don't know. Possibly. That was a
They do say, I heard this somewhere, and it's weird, but I just learned this, that they brought it back, and they say that it was contracted sexually, and you can only get it from animals.
Oh, I don't know about this. You're taking me
really
too far.
Strange. It was very strange to know that.
There are a lot of diseases that you can get from animals and are transmitted this way. I don't know. But he took more diseases with him than he brought back. That's sure, and killed many more people that way. But so the Catholics, even there was once held a famous debate within the Catholic Church about whether the Native Americans, whether they had souls or not. This was an important philosophical and religious question. Have you heard about this before? They debated this. The reason being, yeah, Nora wants to say something.
And like they justified all of the brutal things they did to Native Americans by the fact that these people do not have souls.
That was one of the arguments. Eventually, the church decided they had souls. So too bad for the ones they had already killed. I guess they sent them to heaven, so I guess it's not so bad. But there was arguments on both sides. Why? Because if they have souls, then you have to save them. You have to convert them, and you can't just treat them like property. So it was important. It was interesting for a lot of people for them not to have souls, because then you could mistreat them and turn them into slaves, which would make you even more money. And this is why it was a huge debate. But they eventually did decide they had souls, which meant they had to send armies of priests out there to save them and convert them to Catholicism, which they did, right? So that's why South America is largely Catholic. So Christianity is here. We'll see Christianity is very important for Bacon and the spreading of Christianity. I forget what the fourth symbol might have been there, but I'll remember it. So I believe we're out of time. Yes. So we didn't get that far, but there's a good introduction there. Do read nevertheless the story for Thursday. We may or may not get to it then, but do read it and annotate it. Okay. I'll see you all on Thursday.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you, Professor.